The wake-up call really was that my mother died very suddenly, and I had not expected it. I was at work when she died. I had told her that I didn't have time to go Christmas shopping with her and all those other things that she would have liked to do. And it ended up becoming the last time we did that. And so I realized that I was giving work my everything. But work wasn't giving me what I needed, which was being a human being.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Finding Equilibrium show. I'm delighted to be here, delighted you're here, and delighted that my guest today is Jeanette Bronée. I'm really excited about this conversation because there are so many things that we're mutually interested in. But Jeanette is a wellbeing coach, a wellbeing strategist, and a keynote speaker. And it's great to see you today. How are you, Jeanette?
I am very good. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to our conversation and see where it will take us.
Indeed. And you're, for the viewers who aren't familiar with your work, it would be great if you start by just introducing yourself a little bit more fully. Where are you today? So you're in New York.
I'm in upstate New York. So sometimes I'm a New Yorker, and sometimes I'm an upstate girl, but I'm actually originally Danish. And so the work I do today as a well-being culture strategist, sort of interestingly enough, probably started from all the way back then when I first entered the workforce in Denmark, because Denmark sort of already has that well-being strategy as part of a core place of starting point when we talk about culture. And I worked with culture all the way back in the 80s, but we just didn't call it culture. We called it work. And through my career in the fashion and design business and being a burned out fashion executive, and then ending up with both of my parents having cancer at the same time, just a year apart, dying just a year apart, I decided it was time to help people survive, work better, and change the way we work. So for a long time, I was a coach and helped people sort of figure out how to be busy and healthy at the same time, really focusing around our well-being and our sort of like that balance between physical, emotional, and mental health. And then some years ago, maybe about 5 years ago, I sort of stepped seriously into the more culture focus and keynote speaking. And I do that both from here in my studio, and I also travel around the world and do that. And I've been very, very privileged to be able to do that.
Amazing. So maybe if we step right back and start, because there are so many different questions and areas, but maybe the first question, if we start with, how would you define well-being? It's one of these terms that is used a lot. We often hear about well-being strategists and strategies and self-care. There's a lot of different terminology, but if we could unpack that a little bit. So how would you define well-being? And then we can talk a little bit more about self-care and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think, people often use wellness and well-being sort of in the same sentence. I feel that there is a difference between wellness being more that physical, active health, the stats of our health. Are we healthy or not? Where well-being is more how we feel. Do we feel nourished? Do we feel supported? Do we feel that we're at our best? Do we feel that we can navigate what comes our way? Do we feel safe? Do we feel we belong? Like all of those aspects that come into how we live our lives, not just sort of like the stats of are we healthy or not, but more how we actually feel that we have agency. I think agency is a really big part of well-being. And that's just my way of looking at it. I'm not saying this is the sort of like official, this is well-being and this is wellness, but that's my sort of look at the distinction between the two. When people are asking me, is it wellness? Well, it's like, I don't tell you what to do, but I help you find the way forward through that sort of internal questions and getting to know yourself better so that you actually know what is it that I need so that I can thrive at my best, rather than really looking at the sort of what am I supposed to do to be healthy kind of aspect. I don't know if that makes sense in the context of how you think of it, but that's how I think of it. And when I think of self-care, I look at it more as a relationship we have with ourselves, more so than the habits of what we think self-care is. And I do think that we've been doing ourselves a disservice, or the disservice that's happening right now, where so much is becoming self-care. Like burning candles is called self-care. Going and taking a bath or going on vacation and getting pampered, we're calling that self-care. I call it being pampered and having a treat. I don't think of that as essentially self-care. I believe that we need to bring self-care with us all day long, every single day, because it's a mindset that's underlying how we approach this relationship we have with ourselves, that shows up in the relationship we have with others, and therefore shows up in our relationship at work. So self-care to me is a lot more of an attitude, if you can call it that. And again, back to that, that sense of having agency over our own life, knowing what we need, more so than fitting into those habits that we're supposed to do or treating ourselves after work. I believe self-care and well-being is how we work better, so that we don't end up using our evenings and weekends to recover.
Interesting. So when you look back at your life, for example, when you're in the fashion industry, if you knew what you know now, then how would your work have been different? You know, if you, because what you described in terms of the fashion industry and well-being don't necessarily go together. You know, it's like many industries, and we see this through our work at Wellbeing at Work. You know, we have lawyers, we have lots of industries that are not known for, you know, being good for your well-being, and they're trying to change, and there's a lot of good examples there. But time obviously is a great teacher, and you went through an experience of work, and you know, had a successful career, but also had challenges around that. So if you were looking back, advising yourself now, how would it be different, you know, given your mindset around self-care and well-being, and how you describe it now, which makes a huge amount of sense when I hear you speak?
I will say that I had forgotten everything, or let's say I've abandoned my self-care completely while I was in the fashion industry, hence why I had 2 burnouts. You know, I lived on coffee. I basically lived on coffee, and thought that the anxiety and stress that was driving me every day was just normal, and that's how it is. That said, when I came from Denmark and started my my career in America, in New York, and I asked the person who sort of showed me around my new offices, you know, and I asked, where do people eat lunch? She basically looked at me and she's like, what do you mean? I'm like, where's the canteen where people go and hang out for lunch? And she's like, number one, we don't have one. Number two, we don't take lunch. And if we do, we eat at our desk while we're working. And I was like, that's crazy, because I came from a culture where it was mandatory to take lunch together, because it was part of how we could bond and have conversation that allowed the culture to thrive, not just our personal health, but our sort of organizational health too. And so I think I was really either very spoiled or was really working in a world before I came to the US that was at the forefront of thinking, how do we get the best out of our people rather than how do we get everything out of our people? So I think I bought into that whole work harder, work all the time, don't go home until, you know, eat at the office, you know, as much as you can, both breakfast and dinner, and forget about lunch. Like, that's how I lived for quite a while. And especially living on coffee took quite a toll on my health. And to be honest, the wake up call wasn't just the burning out. It was the wake-up call really was that my mother died very suddenly. And I had not expected it. I was at work when she died. I picked up the phone earlier in the day to talk to her, and she could barely speak. She was out of breath, and I told her to get to a hospital. And later that afternoon, I got the call that she had passed. And looking back, number one, I didn't get to say goodbye to her. Number two, while she was in cancer therapy, I didn't take time off to go and be with her while she was doing that. And number three, I had told her that I didn't have time to go Christmas shopping with her and all those other things that she would have liked to do. And it ended up becoming the last time we did that. And so I realized that I was giving work my everything. But work wasn't giving me what I needed, which was being a human being. And not just that, they fired me after my mother died, because then I had to take care of my dad. And it was a real wake-up call to recognize that not only this idea that we give up ourselves and our health and our joy and our personal lives to work. What I realized afterwards was I hadn't even been working at my best, because I have been exhausted, because I had been stressed out, and because I didn't have a personal life at the other side of it. So it was this very sort of like moment of I was about to say moment of justice, but that's not true. Moment of reckoning, where I really had to look at my choices that I'd been making and recognizing that that's not sustainable. So yeah, there was no self-care or well-being in the work life that I had at the time at all.
It's interesting because it becomes normal, doesn't it? Because like your background, growing up in Denmark, you were part of a culture where the normal was to have lunch together. You know, it's a bit like, you know, many European countries, Scandinavian countries are like that. But you go to America and suddenly that normal isn't normal. But instead of everyone adapted and saying, well, actually, we're all you adapted because that's the normal, and we all want to be you know, included and accepted and all of those things. But I'm interested in the steps, because a lot of people are going to relate to what you've said. You know, I certainly do. You know, we all I lived on coffee for a long time, and you know, had to kick the habit. And I think there's two things as well, really, and I'm interested in your belief whether, because you had a big change, you know, a tragedy in your life, losing your mother, you know, forcing you to look into the mirror of truth and recognize that your behaviors weren't sustainable, and then you created a massive change, which has led to the present day. But do you believe that you could change in that environment? Because I'm curious, because often we feel that we have to make a choice between work and a work and career and our health and well-being. And I guess everything that we talk about is that shouldn't be a choice. We should be able to have everything. We should be able to go to work. Work should be part of our well-being, because it delivers lots of things, and we shouldn't have to sacrifice our health in the way that you experienced, and to get to the point of burning out. So is it possible to evolve? Like, if you play back your own experience, could you have changed? Like, could you have adapted? Could you have brought in some of the tools that you now share with other people that could help them do better in that environment, or at least have more of a sustainable health and well-being strategy that incorporates the self-care mindset that you described before?
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind. One, that I did stand up for myself, and I did eat lunch, because I did say to my boss, he basically said to me, I don't eat lunch, you don't need to eat lunch. And I basically said, I need to eat lunch because I can't function hangry. I was hypoglycemic at the time. There was no way I could function without lunch. But, you know, it was kind of like one of those shove it down kind of like thing, but at least I had lunch. So there is that aspect of saying, I need this so that I can. And I don't know if anyone is going to say, no, you have to keep working and not eat lunch. You know, if we're arguing for the fact that, listen, I can't function without food, you know, like, I do think that it's okay for us to speak up and say, "No, this is what I need so that I can." I think that's an important aspect of it. I think it's a lot more permitted now and accepted now that we actually have a lunch break. I think we've all come to realize that that is actually what boosts performing, not just working through, but that is the rethink, right? Because I bought into performance means that we work all the time. I bought into it, even though I knew better. I was an athlete as a kid. I was a competitive gymnast. I knew that I wasn't going to be at my best without support system of, water, food, sleep, whatever, and coaching. Like I knew that, and yet I abandoned it, right? Because I was sort of seduced into this idea that I was, the badge of honor of working through till exhaustion, and I do think that COVID has given us the gift of pausing and looking at that and saying, wait a minute, this is not working. We need to be healthy to sustain what we're doing all together, both together and personally, both as a culture and personally. So I do think there's a change happening now that makes it okay to speak up. I think leaders are asking more, how can I help? At least I think they must say, what do you need so that you can get through this, rather than just, asking people to do more. So I do think that there is that shift and change that's happening. I think I'm a little lost in my own answer, but I will get back to your question. What could I do? I think the other part of that is to really recognize that we are not understanding the true essence, the true power of self-care. And that's really what we are still battling with, or we're still having that conversation, right? That self-care matters, and that it's actually not just about taking time out. Self-care isn't just about getting away and taking time off. It's important, but if we can actually use self-care as a support system all day long, I think that's the conversation that we're still, learning to have, is how does it actually function on a daily basis in the workday. And I think that's where it's hard for us to just speak up and say, I need this, because I don't think we actually still know. Well, we know, but do we really know, right? Do we know that we need it? I think it's too easy for us to buy into this idea that we can just push through, and then tomorrow I'll take better care of myself. It's such a survival mode mentality. And that's probably where we really still need to wake up to the importance of supporting who we are as human beings, and recognizing that that's actually pretty awesome, rather than thinking that we're not good enough therefore we need to keep just working harder and pushing harder. And I think that's a big part of that well-being conversation and the mental health conversation as well, that we're recognizing that we're not a problem to solve. Like, being human isn't a problem to solve. It's actually an understanding of how to truly support what drives us, and therefore harness that advantage that we have as human beings, our advantage to care, our advantage to have constructive, positive, creative conversations and thoughts and like ideas, like all of those things that make us, good at our jobs. And really pausing for a moment and realizing that true performance doesn't lie in working harder, faster, more. It lies in pausing and really making discerning choices and decisions. And we can't do that on survival mode. We can't do that on stress. We can't do that when we're under, driven by fear and uncertainty and doubt. I was coaching an executive at some point who had this conversation with me that when I was encouraging to, ask more questions of his direct reports and say, hey, you can, instead of saying, why haven't this been done yet? If somebody's behind on a project, you can ask them, what do you need so you can get this done? And he was like, I kind of get that, but you also have to agree with me that if people are not getting things done, it's out the door. And I was like, well, that's not a mindset that helps people feel safe. And that's a mindset that as a leader doesn't actually get results. What it gets is somebody working on fear and uncertainty and doubt, and they're second guessing themselves, and they're trying to do what you want them to do. They're actually not using their ability to solve the right problem. And if we can really pause and realize and ask that question, like, how do we as human beings work at our best? And I think it's individual for each of us. A lot of people love stress, but they don't really understand what happens to them and how it impacts the way they work, the way they think, the way they engage with other people, that kind of stuff.
It's really interesting. What comes to mind when I hear you speak is the understanding of the role of the leader today, because the leader's got to have the self-care mindset, and there's a lot of pressure being a leader, but the leader impacts the well-being of the culture more than anybody else. And we hear terms like psychological safety and those types of terms that are popular at the moment, but it all comes down to the leader. It's exactly what you said. It's creating that environment where we as people feel safe. And then, of course, if we're feeling safe, we can do our best work. Whereas if we're feeling in the emergency room, then we're not going to be doing our best work. We're on that kind of adrenaline survival. And of course, that's where you get burnout. So the work that you
shortcuts.
Do, and shortcuts, of course, we're not making decisions, and that's it's interesting. Do you feel, because in many ways, the role of the leader, there's a difference between the short term and the long term. So what you described, it's a case of, okay, you haven't performed, so you're out the door, and we'll get the next person in, and if they don't perform, they're out the door. So it comes back to this word sustainable. It's just you end up burning through lots of people, and they get, so there's no well-being at all in that kind of wider context. But if you're willing as a leader to invest in a person, I love that question. What do you need to be able to deliver on this? Maybe it's training, maybe there's all kinds of reasons why people get stuck, but it's a much more caring approach to leadership. And you can see, if someone asked you that question, then you're going to naturally feel it's like we're working together, as opposed to like I'm working. It's a completely different area. Are you finding that as you work with different leaders, that leaders are open to that approach? Because of course, if you've been trained in one, it's a bit like if you had a brutal parent, you often think, well, these are the techniques that work. And if you grew up or started working through the 80s, 90s, then that was the common approach in management. So you just, it perpetuates, doesn't it? Are you finding, because it can be a bit of I've got to change now, like everything I've learned is completely inaccurate. So now I've got to change. And how do you do it? Are you finding that leaders are open to embracing a different style of leadership that ultimately is more sustainable, more profitable over a longer term period?
I think leaders are under pressure to change. And I also think they're under pressure. They're burning out as well, because they're trying to figure out, how do I care better? My people are burning out. I don't want them to leave. They're trying to figure out how to be a support system, but they've never been taught how to be a support system. That's not a leadership skill that has normally been part of a leadership growth trajectory. Isn't how do you care about your people, right? So leaders today find that they need to care for their people, that they need to solve the problem. This is one thing I see a lot. It's a conversation I have with many leaders and companies is, you're actually not there to care for your people and solve their problem. You're there to care about them by telling them that you have their back, you're curious about what they want, you acknowledge what they're going through, you're respecting them, and you're also having empathy for it. You're not solving the problem, but you care about them by asking better questions so that you together can solve the problem, or maybe even coach the person in solving the problem, right? Because if we're being told what to do, there's a good chance we're not going to do it anyway. Like years in health coaching, if you're telling somebody you should do this and therefore you will, they're still going to go and do whatever they used to do, whatever they want to do, right? Nobody wants to be told what to do. We want to figure it out ourselves. We want to feel like we came to this solution. That's how we feel empowered. That's how we have agency. That's how we build confidence. And that's also how we become more so-called like agile in being able to navigate, is by thinking, how do I solve this problem? Knowing that my leader has my back. And a leader shows that they care about somebody by asking questions, not telling people what to do. So if they can shift in that way, and it also takes the pressure off. They're not responsible. And that's what I see a lot of leaders sort of burning out. They don't understand, like, what does it mean that I have empathy? Does it mean that I'm sitting there going, oh yeah, that's really, what does it mean to have empathy, right? And I understand why that's confusing, because again, that's not, a leadership skill that's normally being taught. Leadership skills are normally about, here's the goal, how do we reach the goal, measure, your progress, and so on and so forth. And this shift in thinking that is, reaching our goal is about how we reach our goals, and that is about how we support our people. That is new way of thinking. That is what I call care-driven leadership. And to me, care-driven leadership is not to care for your people and give them all the benefits and so on and so forth. I believe that we need access to benefits and well-being programs and benefits and stuff like that, but that's not solving the problem, right? And we see that companies have taken up and bought into so many more well-being programs, but most companies look at 25, 30, maybe 35% usage. So if we can care about people, we allow people, we give them back the power of self-care. And then they know it's okay. And then they can also use these programs better, because now they know it's part of the process of achieving our goals. It's an integrative process of achieving our goals, rather than saying, okay, work harder and keep doing and keep reaching your goals. And by the way, if you need it, go over there and get a well-being program. That doesn't work. We need to bring it together and see that well-being is the foundation, or at the core of how we succeed and reach our goals. Because well-being is not separate from performance. It's the foundation for performance. And so if we can shift how we think of that and use it as part of the language, I think of it as a new language, basically. Like, how do we have a new language when we talk to each other? How do we ask better questions, and so on and so forth? And that's, one of the things I play with the word care a little bit, right? So that I think of the self-care mindset as our relationship with self is about our self-communication, our self-awareness, our self-responsibility, and our self-expression. And I think of the care-driven leadership as where the care then means that we're addressing people and asking questions from a place of curiosity, acknowledgement, respect, and empathy. So I play with that word of care so that we understand that it's a framework, and we can use it as a framework. And now we have tools. And I think that's the important shift that we need to look at right now, is that we don't just say, we need more well-being. We need to actually, like you and I right now, you're having the conversation with me and say, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean? But also, how do we practice it? How do we implement it? That's the conversation that will create shift in culture, I think.
No, I completely agree. So it's a very interesting way you describe it, that well-being isn't separate, because we have seen the growth in well-being programs. Yeah. But it's much more, I love this, the foundation of everything. And when you say the language changes, how would you, if you look at an organization that kind of gets it and does it, how do they perform differently? Like, how do they behave differently is probably the right question. And so that ultimately there is a culture of well-being. We use this word, these words a lot, but a culture of well-being. I think I understand what you're saying, but I'd love you to almost
Yeah.
describe how a leader would behave in that environment if they get it right, and you look at them and you think, yeah, this organization gets it, these leaders get it, and we can see the benefit and the impact on the performance of the business around that.
Yeah. I don't know that anybody has gotten it yet. And maybe they have. I don't know every single organization, and I'm not there and inside the walls, right? I do think that it's a practice. I think that the idea that we learn that pausing is good, that pausing before we react, pausing before we decide, pausing before we choose. And so part of the new language for a leader is to say, okay, let's just pause here for a moment and let this land, or let's digest this. Just, do we all agree that this is the best way forward? That's also how we create a more inclusive environment, which is also part of well-being, right? Like if we are focused on well-being as being the foundation, we have to actually become more inclusive, because we're allowing people to speak up. That's part of our well-being, is to be heard and seen. Right. And so if we understand how well-being is about feeling safe and feeling included and feeling heard and all of those things, if that's part of well-being, it changes the conversation. And that is up to leadership to do. And that means they really need to learn how to pause, so that they don't just, ask the questions they would normally ask, which tends to be, why is this not done? Or why is this not working? Why you're not doing this? And what happens is that people will focus on the things that are not working. And we get stuck in that. We get stuck in solving the problems that are not working. And I call it solving the wrong problem. And that's when we're working under that sort of negativity, critical mindset of being caught in what's not working. And it's how most people drive business. They look at the problems and how do we solve the problems? If we can pause together and say, okay, we can acknowledge this is the problem, this is not working. And then we can talk about, well, what would good look like? What would good look like? And what are the steps for us achieving that? Now we're focusing on how to solve the problem and the direction we want to go in. Right? And so that's a big shift actually in how we work together. It's a very big shift in how we work together. And it's a way to have these conversations that, well, for lack of a better word, more care driven, but they're based on curiosity. They're based on saying, well, how do we grow from this? How do we not just discuss the mistakes and who to blame? And which is very much part of a corporate setup, is sort of like the covering my butt kind of approach, right? Like, how am I making sure that I'm not getting blamed for anything? A lot of people have that going in their mindset all the time. It's just causing more stress. And we have to recognize that most people don't burn out from working too hard if they're having a good time. They're burning out from worrying too much. They're not feeling safe. That's what burns us out. We don't feel safe. We don't feel included. We don't feel that we matter. We're feeling frustrated. There's not enough conversation about how to reach the goals we actually want to reach. And that co-creation that can happen between a leader and a team, or within a team as well. It doesn't have to just be, it's also within teamwork and within groups, is to allow everyone to be like, okay, how do you think we can reach it? Right. And it's very, it's a shift of how we automatically react as human beings. We tend to automatically go to, this is not working. And we think we grow through fixing what's not working. That's the relationship we have with ourselves, right? We're thinking of all the things that are wrong with us and how do I fix what's not working so I can be a better person? Instead of just tossing all that out the window and just be like, okay, this is what good would look like. This is how I would like to harness my career, my power, myself. What do I need so I can get there? And then we can stop talking about all of this stuff. It's like getting unstuck. And I'm not dismissing any of it, because I'm not dismissing trauma. I'm not dismissing depression and all the things that we go through in life. I don't think we should just suppress it. That's not my point. But we don't have to fix it. We have to acknowledge it and integrate it into our growth, but we don't have to solve that problem, because in the past, what we do have to do is heal it by asking ourselves, what do I need so that I can move forward? Okay, maybe I need more support. Maybe I need, and I think a leader can ask a person, hey, how do you work the best? What kind of support do you need from me as your leader? Or you can ask in a group and a team, how do you work best? What kind of support? How do I best support you? And let people say, this is how I work best. Not only do we grow because we take responsibility ourselves for how we are supported, but we get a better dynamic. And we don't have to, like, I don't know about you, but I've many times as a leader tried to figure out, how do I help people? Instead of just asking them. Like, I think the best tool for a leader is a very small tool.
Yes.
Ask them.
It's amazing because it's just asking. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? It sounds so simple. Like, as a leader, your greatest asset, we hear this, are your people. And if you recognize that those people have got immense talents, immense capability, and if you ask them and create an environment that allows them to do their best work and to flourish, then of course everyone's job is easier, and the results, and you get the results, you get the impact. So there's a lot of unwinding, isn't there? Unlearning a lot of leadership approaches that we've grown up in or grown up with, and using these new approaches, because it sounds simple. Ask them, create an environment of care, recognize. And I just going back to one of your earlier points, the pandemic has been very challenging, but I think it has forced us to recognize that the old way of operating has not worked, and we have to create an environment which is going to be much more conducive to well-being, both in work and out of work, because that's the other big acknowledgement, that our work life, if we spend our life worrying about not feeling safe, let's say, then of course that's going to impact into your personal relationships and all aspects, and really create that burnout. Wonderful. We're almost.
It also takes a little, if I may say, it also takes the burden off of the leader a little bit, because the leaders are really, like, they're taking way too much responsibility for having the answer.
So it's almost like everyone's problem becomes your problem, whereas really it's one problem where we're all responsible for. So, and the leader's job is to facilitate, to coach, really, because what you describe is like a coaching style of leadership, as opposed to more of a directive style of leadership. And so wonderful. One last question that I ask all of my guests. I mean, given all the changes and all the things that are actually happening, this is the Finding Equilibrium podcast. And what do you do on a daily basis to make sure that you're in balance and that you're in equilibrium? How do you support yourself? How do you just maintain the true environment of self-care that you teach to others? I'm really curious to know what you do.
Yeah, I have a structure that I think of as my scaffolding. You know how when you're building a house, you need a scaffolding, and so I think of that as my support system, and that includes when I break for food. It includes having 5 to 10 minutes between meetings so I can go get some water and go to the bathroom, make some tea. So there's the small things that I know sustains me throughout the day. And I know that I need to step away after a certain amount of hours. We function best at our focus is best at 45 to 90 minutes. And so I can recognize when I start to trail off and my focus isn't there anymore. So I at this point know myself well enough to know how long I can go on a good day. On a not so good day or on a bad day, I also know how long I can go. So I know I need to build in those pauses as part of my structure. And so I do that as part of my schedule. Can I push through here and there if I need to? Sure, I can, but it's not my normal way of working. So it's not like I'm going to fall apart if all of a sudden I don't get the same pauses and so on and so forth. It just means that I haven't drained myself for 5 days in a row, and now I need the weekend to recover. I'll do that throughout the day. And so therefore I can work at my highest capacity for a couple of hours at a time, instead of trying to do it all day long, which is just actually impossible. We think we can, but we're actually not working at our best. So that's one thing. And the other thing I'm deadly honest about how I feel. If I will check in with my emotions and be really honest with myself. And I ask myself the same question: how am I feeling in there right now? Okay. All right. I acknowledge that. And then I ask myself, what do I need so I can feel whatever it is I need to feel? So if I feel really concerned and anxious about something, I'm not just going to push that away. I'm going to pause for a moment and be like, this is making me anxious. I don't need to figure out why it makes me anxious. I just need to acknowledge it makes me anxious. And then I can ask, what do I need so I can feel more confident about this? And then I can focus on that. And so I solve the problem of feeling more confident rather than getting stuck trying to figure out why I'm anxious. It's a waste of time. Again, I'm not dismissing that we need to sometimes figure out what is causing our distress, but in the middle of the workday, that's not what we need. We need to just figure out, how do I get through and what do I need in order to support myself? So I use my own tools a lot. I will ask before every single meeting, what do I need so that I can feel really present in this meeting? And sometimes that might mean that I need to let something be that's bothering me. Or it may need that I haven't processed something from another meeting and I need to actually sit down and just really go through what it is that I need to just process, digest, and promise myself I can put it aside and get back to it later. I learned that from being a gymnast, that if your mind is distracted by something you're worrying about, you can hurt yourself, right? You can really hurt yourself in a flip-flop or in, all of those things. You cannot be distracted. But that doesn't mean you're suppressing it and ignoring it. It means you're coming back to it later. And so those are tools that I think is important that we learn, because putting it aside for now is not the same as suppressing how we feel. And I think it's the suppressing of how we feel that causes our well-being to fall apart.
I love that.
So using these tools to really acknowledge ourselves, accept the circumstances for what they are, and then ask, what do I need so that I can? I call it my AAA. I think that's a really, really important basic tool. Sorry, my dog just sneezed. That's a really, really basic but super important tool to get us unstuck.
Thank you for sharing that. That's incredibly valuable. Jeanette, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I'd love to acknowledge you for the amazing work you've done. It's when I listen to your life, it's almost like each of the chapters really come together, like your early life as a gymnast in Denmark, and then your fashion career, and and now what you do, inspiring so many people and sharing such, they're life-changing tools. They really, if you embrace these tools and integrate these tools, they change your life. They change the way you lead, the way you manage, the way you operate. Where can people find out more about you and your work and get in touch if they need? Because I'd love you just to explain. You said you do keynotes, and I know you do coaching, but I'd love you to just share with the audience how people can work with you.
Sure. JeanetteBronée.com. It's, my name. I'm probably the only one in the world with that name. And no, it's not Danish. It's actually French. My ancestors were French. So JeanetteBronée.com, and you can find everything I do, both in terms of coaching teams, working with leaders to build a better culture, but also keynotes and training programs and things like that. I don't have training programs you can buy into, but I work with companies to develop training programs for their people.
So my last question, which I'd love your perspective on, is this is the Finding Equilibrium show, but what does equilibrium mean to you? How do you define balance?
I think of it as something we don't have, find, or keep. I think of it as something we keep finding, keep reclaiming, keep sort of engaging with, so that it's more about not a place to land, but an action to to constantly move with. And I think I learned that from being a gymnast, having to walk on the balancing boom. You could not be still. You had to constantly move to keep your balance as you performed on the balancing boom. And so to me, it's that constant engaging with what is that gives us the sense of balance.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day in New York, and thank you again for spending time with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you, everyone. We will see you next time.